Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Welcome to What's Left, the show that used to be called Left Side of the Aisle, and I think I'll say that maybe once more. I'm your host. My name is Larry Erickson, and for the next almost half hour or so, I'm going to be going on about some things that I hope you'll find some interest in. As always, if you have any reactions to the show, you can email them to me directly. This is my personal email here, whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Or if you didn't catch that, go to my website, Lotus Surviving a Dark Time is what it's called. The URL will be here during the show a couple of times. You can get the email address from there, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. As always, if you do send me email to requests, include something in the subject line that makes it clear it's about the show, it's not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer. So with that, let's get on with it. And we're going to start with something that eventually, believe it or not, turns into something that's kind of sort of good news. Yemen is the poorest country in the Middle East, and it has been a bloody civil war since late 2014. Even as the world was distracted by Syria, the death and destruction in Yemen continued. It's estimated that upwards of 10,000 people have been killed in this war. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs calls it the Forgotten War. The health service in Yemen has completely disintegrated, they say. 1.5 million children in the country are malnourished, 370,000 of them severely malnourished. UNICEF reports that of the total population of 27 million people, something over 21 million, about 80% of the entire total, is in need of humanitarian aid. Half of those people are children. Of that 27 million, 3.3 million have been forced from their homes. Over half are food insecure, which what that means is that from one day to the next, they don't know if there's going to be enough food for them and their families. Over 2/3 lack access to safe drinking water, which is connected to an outbreak of cholera that has occurred in the country, with the World Health Organization reporting over 5,500 cases the end of last month. Now, I'm not even going to try to disentangle the history of the conflict, especially since this is hardly the first internal war that Yemen has seen. Yemen has experienced, let's put it this way, I'll just note that the actual fighting broke out when Houthi rebels seized control of Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen, in September 2014, and a few months later seized the presidential compound, forcing President Abdrabbuh Mansour Hadi, is his name, to flee the country. He did that in late February 2015. Since then, the fighting between supporters of the Hadi government, with outside aid coming from U.S. drone strikes and Saudi Arabia work, and the Houthi on the other side with outside aid from Iran, that war has continued and has just gotten more vicious over time. As a quick aside, to show you how messy such civil wars can quickly become, among those supporting the Houthi are supporters of Hadi's predecessor as president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was forced from office by a massive uprising and protest, which were supported by the Houthi. Now, despite the ongoing brutality and suffering, neither side in this war has managed to gain a decisive advantage. Okay, so what's the sort of kind of good news? Because it appears we could use some right about now. The good news here is that actually, or at least it appears there is actually, a limit to the atrocities that our government will tolerate in the name of stability or in the name of fighting terrorism. Since March 2015, Saudi Arabia has been leading what we so euphemistically call an air campaign in Yemen. It has consisted of bombing attacks on hospitals, schools, markets, factories, and other clearly civilian targets. And it has consisted, that is, of war crimes. And now, belatedly, and after multiple protests, finally, the United States has decided to limit its military support to Saudi Arabia's campaign by cutting off supplies of certain weapons. Now, exactly what weapons are involved here is not actually certain, but it does involve precision-guided munitions, which the U.S. had been supplying to Saudi Arabia on the grounds that precision-guided munitions make it easier to avoid hitting civilian targets, only to have those weapons used by Saudi Arabia, it appears, to more accurately target civilian targets. It finally got to be too much, even for the cold hearts of the U.S. military establishment. However, the reason this is sort of kind of good news is that while we can be glad of the decision, it's not nearly enough. It's not the cutoff of aid that a lot of people were working for. For example, the United States will keep refueling the aircraft that Saudi Arabia is using in this bombing campaign and will continue other arms sales to the kingdom, including a $3.5 billion deal for Chinook cargo helicopters, which the U.S. insists will not be used in any offensive action in Yemen. But as a result of these shortcomings, William Hartung of the Center for International Policy called the decision to stop supplying the precision-guided munitions a weak signal. Sama Hadid of Amnesty International said the move falls short of what is needed, and Representative Ted Lieu of California called the decision to continue refueling the aircraft utterly bizarre. And there is one other point to consider. This is not the U.S.'s first hesitant step away from the embrace of Saudi Arabia's war crimes. In May, Washington suspended sales to Riyadh of cluster munitions. And in August, the U.S. military began to back away further from aiding Saudi Arabia by pulling out a planning team that was helping to coordinate bombing raids. Now, some people have actually suggested that these moves, and this latest one, are less about any moral judgment on Saudi Arabia's war crimes, because Saudi Arabia, remember, is an important regional ally that historically we have gone to great lengths to avoid offending. But rather, these people suggest these moves are more about concern among some U.S. officials that not doing something makes the U.S. complicit in the war crimes. But whatever the reason, and yes, however weak the signal, we still should be glad this decision was made. But now it's time to pull the plug on all military aid and sales to the repressive regime of Saudi Arabia, because now that would be good news. Oh, and by the way, as a quick footnote to that, yes, the U.S. is still doing drone attacks in Yemen. The military acknowledges 4 this year, all supposedly targeted at AQAP, which is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which controls some territory in east central Yemen. But the NewAmerica.org claims that there have been 38 drone strikes in 2016. The actual number is uncertain, particularly because the U.S. generally only acknowledges a drone strike when some so-called high-value target is killed, or when they sort of like embarrassed and forced to acknowledge it because of the civilian casualties it caused. But no, the drone war in Yemen has not stopped just because we don't hear about it in the midst of the roar of war in Syria and Iraq. Okay, next up, something we actually can call good news. On December 13th, more than 100 employees of technology companies, including Google, Twitter, and Salesforce, published an open letter in which they pledge not to help the incoming regime of Donald the Rump to create a data registry to track people based on their religion or to assist in mass deportations. The employees are a mix of engineers, designers, and business executives, drew on comparisons to the Holocaust and to the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II to reflect their opposition. Quoting the letter, "We are choosing to stand in solidarity with Muslim Americans, immigrants, and all people whose lives and livelihoods are threatened by the incoming administration's proposed data collection policies. We refuse to build a database of people based on their constitutionally protected religious beliefs. We refuse to facilitate mass deportations of people the government believes to be undesirable." The signers also pledge, among other actions, to work within their organizations to limit the collection and retention of data that would be used to facilitate such a database, or that would facilitate ethnic or religious targeting. And in the event they discover within their organizations unethical or illegal misuse of data, they pledge to be what they call responsible whistleblowers and to resign rather than to participate in it themselves. By early Thursday morning, the original group of 100 signers had grown to 1,233 and was still growing. Now that is the kind of news, good news, that we can really use, because actually it comes in the wake of some not good news. In the wake of the Rumps election and the embrace of the raging xenophobe Chris Kobach, who kind of reminds me of Jack Nicholson in The Shining, with his coming administration and the resulting claims that the Rump was actually serious about the Great Wall of Orange on the Mexican border and about a registry for Muslim immigrants, the online magazine The Intercept contacted 9 U.S. technology companies to ask if that company would, quoting the question, this is a quote, if solicited by the Trump administration, sell any goods, services, information, or consulting of any kind to help facilitate the creation of a national Muslim registry, a project which has been floated tentatively by the president-elect's transition team, unquote. After 2 weeks of emails and phone calls, 6 of the 9, Facebook, Google, Apple, CGI, IBM, and SRA International, wouldn't even provide an answer. Booz Allen Hamilton did answer, if you regard declined to comment as an answer. Microsoft said that the company would not discuss hypotheticals before offering the deeply disturbing observation that, quoting, it will remain important for those in government and the tech sector to continue to work together to strike a balance that protects privacy and public safety in what remains a dangerous time. Has it ever occurred to you that anytime anybody talks about a balance between privacy and security, what they really mean is that we should have less privacy and more government surveillance? The fact is, of these 9 companies, only one of them actually said no, and that was Twitter. Twitter, which also referred the magazine to a company policy statement saying, and I'm again quoting here, we prohibit developers from allowing law enforcement or any other entity to use Twitter data for surveillance purposes, period. Now, this was apparently done in the wake of reports that police forces around the country were using people's social media feeds to track and surveil anti-the Rump protesters in the protest following the election. Writing for The Intercept, reporter Sam Biddle notes that the lack of an answer from the other companies does not mean that they are actually tacitly endorsing the idea of the Rump's agenda in general or a Muslim registry in particular. But even so, he wrote, it's hardly asking a lot of tech companies to go on record as unwilling to create a federal registry of Muslims. But apparently for a lot of them, it is asking too much. So good on Twitter, and that is good news. But the silence from the others, except for a creepy blather about balance, definitely comes under the heading of not good news. All right, next up, one of our, now it's apparently going to be recurring features called For the Record, where you deal with something very quickly just to make sure it gets said. So For the Record, a website called lifescript.com. It's one of those smirking, however you are living your life, you are doing it wrong sites geared for women, recently had a piece entitled, Grow Up Already, 20 Trends You're Too Old to Wear. That's right, it was actually about setting age limits for certain sorts of clothing or fashions, punctuated with the fashion advice about timeless looks that amounted to, act your age and look like everybody else did. Well, I would say that women would do better. My own notion here is that women would do better by dumping that kind of sexism, that sexist guidance, and instead reading Jenny Joseph's poem that begins, "When I am an old woman, I shall wear purple with a red hat that doesn't go and doesn't suit me," and realize that you don't have to be old to wear purple. And for the record, when Fidel Castro died a few weeks ago, it was immediately clear that in the U.S. media, the old chestnut about not speaking ill of the dead did not apply to him. Accounts were filled to the brim with denunciations of his communist dictatorship and other sins. And yes, it's true, there was quite enough to condemn, although some room, frankly, could have been found to comment on the improvements in healthcare and education that were also part of that history. But what I wanted to quote here was the pointed and worthwhile observation of British blogger Avedon Carroll, who said, quoting, "Whatever else you may know about Cuba, you should certainly remember that there is a prison on that island where people have been held and tortured for 14 years without charges. And Cuba does not run that prison." And we're taking a break. And we're back. All right, next up, a couple of updates we've got about things that we've talked about recently. The first one is another case of taking your good news where you can find it, because the news is never all good. Last week, in discussing the victory at Standing Rock, I mentioned that Energy Transfer Partners, the developers of the DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, were suing in federal court in Washington, D.C., insisting that the court should order the Army Corps of Engineers to issue the easements for the project that the company wanted. Now, the good part of the update is that on December 9th, the judge in the case, James Boasberg, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but Judge Boasberg denied a motion by Energy Transfer Partners for an immediate judgment ruling in favor of the company. He preferred to order the company and the Army Corps of Engineers to submit additional motions and pleadings by January 31st. What this means is that the court is prepared for a full hearing on the issue, meaning a decision would likely not be delivered for another couple of months anyway, if not longer. And as I said before, I know of no reason to assume that the decision would be a bad one when it finally comes. But the fact is, this is a sort of case where delay is good. Delay works to our benefit. The bad part of the update, and it is a bad one, is that NBC News is reporting that it wasn't actually the Corps of Engineers that denied the easements or turned away the application for the easements. In fact, the Corps recommended granting the easements, but the agency was overruled by the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, whose name is Jo Ellen Darcy. Now, the problem is that that position, Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, makes her a management-level political appointee whose tenure in the position ends with the end of the Obama administration. And that is unless she is reappointed by the rump. And considering that he wants to bring back coal, he wants the CEO of ExxonMobil to be his Secretary of State, and it turns out that Rick Oops Perry, his pick for Energy Secretary, is on the board of directors of Energy Transfer Partners. That really seems, to put it mildly, to be extremely unlikely. With some new, more agreeable Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works in place, the decision to overrule the Corps could be overturned in a matter of days. And what's more, the Corps could then go into Judge Boasberg's court on January 31st and say it is declining to offer a defense to Energy Transfer Partners' suit, which would easily lead to a summary judgment in the company's favor. Now, that would not be the end of it, because, as I said last week, the attempt to simply undo the decision to do more environmental review would likely spark its own lawsuit, which could tie the thing up for years. So what the news really does is just emphasize how much the fight is not over. But I have to admit, some of this news brings a certain sense of discouragement. a sense for which there is only one cure: renewed people power. And I look forward to seeing that. I look forward to taking part in it as best as I can, even though that's actually very limited these days, and celebrating that people power whenever it happens. All right, next up. This is an update that doesn't require a lot of background. The facts speak for themselves, or as much as they can, in the post-truth world of Donald the Rump. 2 weeks ago, I noted that hundreds of college and university presidents from across the country had signed a statement calling for continuing the policy of Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, D-A-C-A. That policy, begun by executive order in June 2012, allows certain undocumented immigrants who arrived in the U.S. as minors to receive a renewable 2-year period of deferred action on deportation. The update is that advocates for immigrants are now advising folks covered by the program to make sure that they are not out of the country, they're not traveling abroad when President Xenophobe takes office on January 20th, because they are afraid he might immediately rescind the program, with the result that these folks might be barred from re-entering the United States. That is how deep and how real the fear is. And no one can say that that fear is an irrational one. The Rump made immigration the cornerstone of his campaign, promising to build a wall along the Mexican border and to deport undocumented immigrants by the millions. Then later it was, no. Actually, he just wants to focus on those who've committed crimes, which in fact is exactly the Obama policy, which he denounced during the campaign as too soft, even though the amazing Mr. O actually deported more people than any previous president. And continuing his pattern of spewing whatever bilge happens to be flushing through his sewer system of a mind at a given moment, during a recent magazine interview, the Rump expressed sympathy for the 741,000 people in the DACA program, despite having called that same program illegal amnesty during the campaign. And on top of that, no matter what he said, one way or the other on it, his advisors would walk back his comments almost the instant that they were published. All of which gives those who had lived in hope and tried to build a life in the country they knew as home good reason for fear that they will be forced back into the shadows or worse. And it gives the rest of us good cause to stand with them, because as the saying goes, no human being is illegal. All right, another update. Last week I mentioned that Keith Faber, the president of the Ohio State Senate, had said that the election of the Rump was what prompted the Ohio legislature to pass the nation's strictest anti-choice measure, one that would ban abortions after roughly 6 weeks of pregnancy, as soon as a fetal heartbeat can be detected, a time when many women won't even know that they're pregnant. Now, a quick sidebar, by the way, it's worth mentioning that the term fetal heartbeat is, as applied in this case, is applied to this law, it's actually medically inaccurate. The proper term is fetal pole cardiac activity, because what's being detected isn't actually a heartbeat, because there isn't actually yet a heart. But getting back to the bill, the update here is that Governor John Kasich, a move happily endorsed by Ohio No Right to Choose, a.k.a. Ohio Right to Life, vetoed the 6-week ban, but signed the bill the anti-choicers really wanted, which had been passed at the same time, a 20-week ban, which right now matches the strictest ban in the country. See, the forced birthers know full well that the fetal heartbeat didn't have a chance of surviving court challenges, particularly since the 2 states who enact such a bill got shot down in court in no uncertain terms. But they wanted Ohio to join the 18 other states which have passed some version of a 20-week ban. And with the passage of the fetal heartbeat measure, Kasich was afforded that position that he loved so much to be in, the ability to appear moderate by supporting the supposed middle course, the 20-week ban as opposed to the fetal heartbeat ban, while actually advancing the agenda of the reactionaries. 3 states have seen their 20-week ban challenged in federal court. All 3 states lost. And when SCOTUS refused to take the case in all three cases. But that means that the lower court decisions only apply to those areas. They don't apply nationally. So they're still hoping that the 20-week ban will be a wedge to get SCOTUS, buoyed by a few reactionary judges during the reign of the Great Orange One, hoping that they get the court to overturn Roe v. Wade entirely. None of this happened without resistance. Protesters descended on the state courthouse and put coat hangers all along the fence. They were taken down, only to have the protesters come back the next day and put more up. The symbolism of that coat hanger is an important one. I've said a number of times that I'm old enough to remember what that symbol really means, and I have no desire to return to those times. Okay, last for this week, something I have not talked about as much as I should, but I'm going to have to get through as much as I can here. On December 13th, Russian ambassador to the UN, Vitaly Churkin, told the Security Council that military action had ended in eastern Aleppo. A deal had been reached for the rebels to leave the city. The rebels confirmed that it had been made. So the battle for Aleppo, the battle and the siege that became the symbol of the utter humanitarian disaster that is the Iraq Civil War, the battle which since 2012 had pitted forces of Bashir al-Assad against a collection of rebel armies, and was essentially a standoff until Russian firepower and Iranian-backed militias turned the tide. That battle appeared to be over. The news came in the wake of what UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called reports of atrocities against a large number of civilians, including summary executions and even burning of people alive, atrocities committed primarily by the Iranian militias in the final days. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights referred to butcheries carried on every hour, and Jens Lerke of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs called it a complete meltdown of humanity. But at least it appeared it was over. And the haunting question, what would you do about Aleppo? The question to which no one had a good answer, to which there was not a good answer, a question which really could only lead to the heart-shredding realization that sometimes there is nothing you can do to ease the suffering and pain without just adding to it. That question was finally resolved, except of course it wasn't. The ceasefire agreement fell apart in less than a day. Because it had been negotiated by Russia and Turkey, and apparently Syria and Iran were ticked off that they weren't part of it, so they prevented it from going into effect. The bombing and destruction had all renewed, even intensified, only to have another ceasefire go into effect the next day after a concession to, notably, not Syria, but Iran. This time it seemed to work. In the very early hours of Thursday, the International Committee of the Red Cross confirmed that the evacuation had begun. So maybe it was finally over. At least for now, at least for some. But on a more, if you will, practical measure, this is undeniably a military and perhaps more important political victory for Assad, for Russia, and perhaps even more for Iran. Aleppo is the last major urban center held by rebels. But this does not mean in any sense that the war is over. Rebel forces in their varying forms, which actually include some terrorist groups like the Al-Nusra Front, which the United States has adopted as moderate only because they say they're against ISIS, those groups still contain large portions of territory in Syria. And the fact is that Assad is now almost entirely dependent upon Russia and Iran for his survival. Meanwhile, Daesh has retaken Palmyra. The future of the war and the future of Syria is a very different question from the fall of Aleppo, and I want to talk more about that next week. But for now, I am literally out of time. So you have the best week you possibly can. We will see you next week with more good news and bad news, I expect. But until then, as always, peace.